It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me, if you want to reach me, at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Just shoot me an email over at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Now, if you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon, the Opperman Report Patreon. I know we just put up some docs up there just recently. I know what it was. We put up the Epstein binder, the concept of the binder with the Epstein release. We put that up there for free in the free section. And we put up the JFK stuff. That's up there for free, too, in the free section on Patreon, Opperman Report Patreon. But also, too, I just did a little interview on Press TV the other day as an expert, believe it or not, on the stock market and tariffs. Okay, we put that up there for free, too, as well. So everything you could find Monday to Friday on AM/FM radio, you could find over there at Patreon, Opperman Report Patreon, with all the ads and the commercials cut out and all that kind of stuff. But otherwise, all of our stuff you can find at Spreaker.com. There's a chat room. You get an email notification when we put up new content. I play repeats every single day of the week. So all the old classic shows you can find there too as well at Spreaker.com, the Opperman Report. Okay, we got one of those great shows today. Marlin Bressi. Okay, he's written a ton of books, mostly true crime kind of stuff. All kinds of stuff. There's a series he's done called Pennsylvania Oddities, okay, which is right up our alley. You know, we love that kind of oddity kind of stuff. And he does a podcast, too, as well, called Pennsylvania Oddities, which you can find at Spotify and all the podcast catchers. It's on the 1st and the 15th of the month, every month, like clockwork. If you want to meet him in person, April 9th, you go to Schuylkill, Pennsylvania, in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, at the Historical Society building at 6:30 p.m. You can meet him there in person, get an autograph, signed copy of his book. The book we're talking about today is Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, 10 Unsolved Murders That Rocked the Keystone State. Mr. Bressi, are you there, sir?
Yes, I am.
Hey, man, thanks so much for coming on the show. Who is Marlin Bressi? Tell us about yourself before we get into this book, Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases.
Well, I'm a true crime author and podcaster from the Harrisburg area of Pennsylvania. I've been doing this for probably about 12 years with the Pennsylvania Oddities book series, and that developed into the blog, and then the blog turned into the podcast, and everything kind of snowballed, and now I have a new book coming out, Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, about 10 unsolved murders from various parts of Pennsylvania.
Well, I tell you, I'm down here in Florida today, and it's 40 degrees, so we may have colder cases than you do. Okay, but otherwise, before we get into Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, the 10 unsolved murders that rocked the Keystone State, Pennsylvania Oddities, the podcast, what kind of stuff do you cover there?
Well, it's interesting. It's a scripted podcast. I don't do any interviews, and there's no live guests. Basically, it's set up kind of like in a format of an old-time radio show. If you ever listen to old radio from like the golden age of radio from the 30s or 40s, complete with sound effects, background music. I do all my own sound effects, all the music, all the writing, the editing, the production, the research. It's a one-man operation, really.
Oh, yeah, man. I love that kind of stuff. I love that old radio, man. And,
yep.
and even the old TV, Abbott and Costello, you know, I love that. The Bowery Boys, man. I love all that old stuff, man.
Yeah, you won't believe like how much money I spend on produce, like on cantaloupes and celery, because you stab them and snap them to make the sound effects, you know.
Well, they must have that stuff. You can get a clip of it, right? It would be a lot cheaper than. And you know what? You can always make soup, though, right? When you finish with the celery. So.
To be honest, it's a lot of fun doing the sound effects. That's probably the most fun part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases. Now, you got 10 unsolved murders that rocked the Keystone State. What's your favorite unsolved murder from Pennsylvania?
Well, there are so many of them I've written about over the years, and I've chosen the 10 best for this book, all based on just the peculiar aspects of the crime. And the one that I really took a liking to was one called the Evil Eye Killing, which took place in 1932 in Philadelphia when a man's body was found on the grounds of an abandoned mansion. The victim was actually a Mennonite church leader, and he had strange symbols carved into his face, occult symbols. If you're familiar with like the all-seeing eye, that was one of the symbols that was carved on his face. One of his eyes was gouged out. He was stabbed 20 times. 8 of the stab wounds actually formed a perfect circle around his heart. So when you see details like that, I mean, obviously that's just something that you read about and you think somebody should write a book about it or put it in a book, and that's exactly what I did.
And you said he was a Mennonite, like what, like a Mennonite minister or pastor?
He's not a pastor, but he was like more into the administrative side. Like he did all the fundraising and put together all the camps and the Bible camps and stuff like that. And he was actually coming home from a meeting about 20 miles away, and he never returned home. And it was an off-duty police officer who was interestingly walking a dog for a judge. I know it's a complicated story, but back then there was this judge who was getting all these death threats, so he had round-the-clock protection. And while this police officer was walking the judge's dog, he saw a black sedan speeding out of this driveway of this long abandoned mansion, and he heard screams and followed it to a cherry tree on the mansion grounds, and under it he found this dying man who was later identified as a 31-year-old man named Norman Bechtel.
Okay, so there's Norman Bechtel. He was like a big shot in the church, like a fundraiser type of guy, you're saying, right?
Yeah, and he was just coming home from a fundraising meeting, and amazingly, his wallet was still in his pocket. None of the money was taken. So robbery obviously wasn't the motive.
And there's enough kind of skullduggery and crime going on in this town that the judge got to watch his own back, that he's got a cop walking his dog for him, right? What? Yeah. So, there's a lot of red flags here, my friend, Mr. Bressi. What was going on in that town with all this stuff, man, you know?
Well, it's a lot of these little details that I think really add a lot to the story. And, if you read the book, you will find these neat little tidbits of, it's not just the evidence and the autopsy reports, but it's all the little details like that. A police officer walking a judge's dog. I just thought it was a neat little story.
Now, when you do these books, do you put the actual copies of the autopsy reports in the books?
Not so much the autopsy reports, but there are a lot of photographs. And I should point out that if you have a weak stomach, in this book that's coming out, Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, there are some pretty graphic photos in the book. So just as a disclaimer.
Yeah, that's a little tough sometimes when you see. Yeah, sometimes you kind of you need a little trigger warning for those bloody photos. I mean, but I got to tell you, my audience loves like police reports and autopsy reports and stuff like that. Any kind of exclusive documents you might have, they love. But okay, so so this guy Beckler, I think his name was, right? Norman.
Yeah, Norman. Yep, Norman Bechtel.
Norman Bechtel. Okay. Now, what was besides his work with the church, did he have an occupation?
No, he was actually, even though he was an adult, he was, I believe, taking classes at the University of Pennsylvania at the time. So he was living in an apartment complex, going to school during the day and doing his church work at night.
How old?
Go ahead.
Now, how old was he?
31.
31, okay, and he's still in school. Was he being supported by his parents or his family or anything like that?
Well, his father, the Bechtels came from Berks County, Pennsylvania, which, as you may know, is a big Pennsylvania Dutch area. In fact, Bechtel is a very, very common name. I went to high school with like 3 or 4 Bechtels. It's a very popular name around here. Well, his father was a prosperous merchant back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Norman moved down to the Germantown section of Philadelphia. Also living in the area was his brother, Wilbur, who plays a prominent role in the murder case as well. I mean, some people believe that Wilbur Bechtel, who was actually the beneficiary of Norman's insurance policies, may have had something to do with it. although it's never been proven. I mean, it's an unsolved murder. That's why it's in the book.
Okay, but that would draw suspicion to Wilbur there, right? You know, because on the insurance policy. But what other like connection would there be to the Mr. Norman Bechtel to the occult? Because this is pretty specific occult stuff, like you're discussing here. This isn't like random kind of occult carvings, right?
Yeah, I think they were very symbolic in nature. Like in Freemasonry, the all-seeing eye is sort of like a reminder that all of your innermost thoughts and your secret deeds are viewed by God. So, and the fact that his eye was removed, that seems to lend credence to the theory that there was a message that somebody was trying to send by these ritualistic carvings.
Okay, so now he's discovered by an off-duty cop, so there must have been a pretty quick police response to this incident. And you said this was back in 1932, right?
Yep.
So it's not like they had any kind of gloves or anything, evidence bags back in those days. So what was the investigation like into this case?
Well, quite frankly, it was a mess. As you can imagine, in the early 1930s in Philadelphia, there's a lot of gangster activity, mob activity, a lot of corruption on the police force. Yeah. And in fact, the investigator who was in charge, the captain of the police force, was a guy named Heenley, and he actually ended up buying the car that belonged to the victim. It was believed that Norman Bechtel was lured to the property. His car was stolen and driven off. They found a car several days later in a rough neighborhood of Philadelphia, blood all over inside the car. And Captain Heenley, while this was an active investigation, by the way, actually purchased the vehicle from none other than Wilbur Bechtel, the victim's brother. Interestingly, Wilbur Bechtel, the brother, also, after he received his insurance payout, also began lending out money to members of the police department. One of those was a detective named Michael Krosky, who was actually borrowing money from Wilbur while this was an ongoing investigation. So this led to a big internal investigation, a massive shakeup. I mean, dozens of city officials and police officers either resigned or were fired. Key pieces of evidence, such as Norman's diary, which was found in his apartment, was either lost, stolen, or destroyed. In fact, the big shakeup was actually a bigger story in the end than the murder. I mean, this was a major chapter in Philadelphia politics.
Yeah, and plus now it even draws more suspicion on the cop that found him. You know what I mean? He's got a bloody car that's stashed away, and suddenly he's found coincidentally by a cop, and then every cop in town is getting money from the insurance policy. You know, was he looked into?
And as a cop, Captain Heenley, he wasn't hiding it either. He actually drove this as his personal vehicle while he was still on duty. I mean, that's how outrageous the police department was back in the 1930s.
Did he at least wash the blood out?
I would hope so.
I don't know, man. This story is so crazy to begin with. Now, what about this Wilbur fellow, man? Did he have any kind of connections to Freemasons or something like that? Or what secrets could he have been holding? And I guess he was a witness or something, right? When they cut your eye out, right? What secrets could he have been holding? Who was he connected to?
Well, here's the thing. The Bechtels, being very strict Mennonites, they were a very upright and religious family. And according to some sources, in Norman's diary, it showed that he was having a gay relationship with a man named John Coles, who was not only gay, he was actually African American. So you can imagine back in the early 1930s what this would have sent shockwaves through the Mennonite community. In fact, according to Norman's diary, he once bought this man, John Coles, who was actually a parking garage attendant who used to park his car. He actually purchased him silk underwear as a gift. So that seems to imply that there was more than just a friendship going on there.
Okay,
Captain Heenley.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, Captain Heenley, in newspaper reports of the early 1930s, he would describe Norman Bechtel as a person of meticulous habits, even a trifle fussy, which I think like in the early 1930s, that's about as close as one could say that a person was homosexual without actually coming out and saying it. Like they refer to him as like a confirmed bachelor. And
Right.
they don't come right out and say that he was in a homosexual relationship, but it is definitely implied. So it seems that perhaps Wilbur knew about this and, he wanted to kind of, I guess, punish his brother just for the shame and disgrace that this would bring upon his family.
Now, did Wilbur have any kind of occult connections that would cause him to use these occult carvings?
None that I could find of. I mean, I looked at the family history, and interestingly, generations earlier, there were other murders that affected this family, unrelated, of course. It's just an odd coincidence. But I do believe the parent, his father, the wealthy person, I think he may have been a Freemason, but I haven't been able to find anything conclusive that shows that there was any sort of cult activity or anything like that.
Now, what about any other local crimes with these similar type carvings and stuff like that?
Well, I know in Philadelphia, around maybe like 1 or 2 years earlier, there was a man who was a night watchman at a foundry somewhere who was actually found hanging in like the boiler room of the factory where he worked, and it was believed that he was part of a religious cult that was also killed. But there seems to be no relation between these two cases other than the fact that they happened in the same area at around the same time. In the early 1930s, there was a big like religious revival going around. Like there were a lot of groups breaking off from churches and forming prayer groups, and a prayer group can easily turn into a cult.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you got that one charismatic leader who dominates the group, and people are so quick to fall in line. But now this fellow here, John Coles, who was he was the gay boyfriend, right?
Yes.
Okay, now you'd think right away, man, he's a black guy, right? He's parking cars. His gay boyfriend. Was he? Why wasn't he immediately arrested and said, "Hey, that's the guy right there"?
He was arrested, but he was eventually released for lack of evidence.
Okay. So then I guess then the DA wasn't in on this game here, but so no one was ever convicted of this crime.
Nope.
Did you get a chance to talk to family members, relatives, distant relatives of these people?
Oh, yeah. In fact, not so much the police officers, but there were a lot of like investigative journalists working for the big city papers in Philadelphia who did track down, relatives and distant relatives, as far away as New Jersey. And everybody was mystified about it. I mean, nobody could figure it out. But, I mean, Wilbur Bechtel seemed to be the official suspect, person of interest. But, again, it was never proven.
When you went on to interview the family members, were any of them generationally involved in occult activities that you could kind of pick up on?
Not unless you consider Pennsylvania Dutch theology as a cult. I don't know how familiar your listeners are, but there is a good deal of witchcraft that goes into old Pennsylvania Dutch.
That's right. I remember those old movies of the week. Yeah, they would, and then they would like put bricks on top of the witches and stuff like that, and bury them alive and things, right?
Well, I don't think. I think that's a little too extreme. They did a lot of like casting out of spells. Like if a farmer's cow wasn't giving milk, they believed that somebody had put a hex on them, and they would hold these weird rituals. They'd put like, just strange objects around the house to ward off evil spirits. Yeah. In fact, if you go to like the Pennsylvania Dutch country and then like Berks County, Montgomery County, and Lancaster County in that area, you'll see like the hex symbols painted on the barns, and those were painted to ward off evil spirits and to keep witches away. So the Pennsylvania Dutch had what they call powwow, which is like a witch doctor who they would call to the house, kind of the same way that a person would call a family physician to the house. And these witch doctors would chant these ancient incantations so there in older generations of the Bechtel family, there was that connection to the Pennsylvania Dutch witchcraft.
Fascinating stuff. Now, how close related are the Pennsylvania Dutch to the Amish?
They're getting a little outside my wheelhouse of expertise. I know it's very easy to mistake the two. I lived for about 6 months in Lancaster County, so I got to tell the difference between the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, the Mennonites, and there are some key differences. I mean, the Amish, I believe, came from Switzerland, whereas the Pennsylvania Dutch actually came from like Germany and Bavaria and places like that. I know German was their primary language. A lot of their newspapers in the United States were actually published in German, and that's why most Pennsylvania Dutch have German lineage.
So then, when you compare the between the Mennonites and the Amish, the type of horseshoes that their horses and buggies would use, could you? I'm pushing my luck, bro. No, that's a fascinating story, but it's still unsolved to this day. Do you have any suspect? I guess your main suspect is Wilbur, right?
Yeah, I mean, although the investigation closed without any. I mean, there were arrests made, but no convictions. Nobody ever stood trial for this. But I believe, I guess it's just my own personal opinion that Wilbur had something to do with it. And there's an interesting side note here. Like a couple days after the murder, Wilbur offered to put up a big $1,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer. But then he changed his mind, and then after consulting with his attorney, he finally posted the reward. And they put up all these hundreds of posters around Germantown and other neighborhoods of Philadelphia. And within days, all the posters were mysteriously torn down. So the Captain Heenley, he ordered a bunch of undercover plainclothes officers to keep a watch on all these like telegraph poles and walls that have all these reward posters on. And every time they put up new reward posters, somebody just kept ripping them down. And a few days after that, Wilbur finally retracted their reward. And so that's just an interesting side note that like somebody was going around tearing down all these reward posters all over the city of Philadelphia, hundreds of them.
And okay, 1932. What kind of money are we talking? Insurance money and assets that this Wilbur have to generate all this kind of activity?
Well, it was interesting because Norman Bechtel, who was only 31, he was very healthy, a very vigorous young man. And it seemed odd that he took out such large life insurance policies at such a young age. Yeah. So I believe that it was around $25,000 in 1930s money, which I don't have like an inflation calculator handy, but I imagine it's quite a lot of money today. Wilbur and his handicapped sister, Elsie, they were named as the sole beneficiaries of the policies.
Okay. Now, what is it about Marlin Bressi that interests you in these old, from the 30s, these old cold cases? They seem to be so much harder. You know, I'm a private investigator, and I would see something that old. I would say, oh, my God, why would I get involved in that? No one's alive. I got to go through old newspaper, microfiche, and all that nonsense. What is it about you that fascinates you, that encourages you to focus on that era?
Well, I think it's just, I think some people just have a strong sense of justice. And when you think about these crimes where all the main characters are dead, all the evidence is lost or destroyed or misplaced, I kind of feel that, after 100 years or so, somebody should be trying to solve these cases. I mean, these were real living and breathing human beings. We tend to think of, old newspaper stories like this and these people, these victims and these killers as almost like fictional characters. But I mean, these are legitimate human beings just like you or me, who lived and breathed and had hopes and dreams and celebrated holidays and had goals and aspirations. And it's sad that, after like 3 generations, there's really nobody left alive who remembers that they they even existed. And there's something sad about that to me. I mean, all murders are tragic and sad, but these forgotten ones, they kind of affect me a different way.
No, I hear you, man. And I guess I'm 63 years old. In my old age, I've been PI for 45 years, criminal defense mostly. You become so jaded, and even like when you're working on like criminal defense cases, you don't even know everybody's name. The aunt, the cousin, the guy in the elevator. You don't even even when you're discussing these cases, you don't even acknowledge the people's names of the sister of the victim, the mother of the victim. You don't even think of them as I don't know, man. It's probably not very healthy.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think when you write about these old stories, when you do the research, it's a lot of genealogy. So you really have to explore like these family trees, and you get to almost feel like you know these people personally in a weird way. And that's why I think I just gravitate towards those older crimes.
And what do you use? I guess you use like genealogy.com and the old the Latter-day Saints. They have great genealogy records. Is that the kind of stuff you use?
Yeah, familysearch.org. I think that's the one you're referring to. I mean, I subscribe to so many genealogy websites, ancestry.com, newspapers.com, a lot of newspaper archives. In fact, I mean, I actually spend more money on memberships than I actually earn from the sales of the book.
I totally believe that, man. And what do you call it? But the libraries have a lot of that stuff for free, though. Do you utilize the public libraries?
Yeah, I do, and I go to historical societies. In fact, I do a lot of speaking engagements at historical societies, but I also visit and comb through their archives and make a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails to complete strangers who are wondering why I'm asking about a dead ancestor of theirs. So it's a labor of love. There's no question about it.
And speaking of historical societies, you can meet Marlin Bressi in person April 9th in Schuylkill, which is near Pottsville, the Historical Society building at 6:30 p.m. And you're going to be discussing this book here, Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, 10 Unsolved Murders that rocked the Keystone State.
Yes.
Oh, okay, so we covered, we didn't solve it. Okay, but we covered one murder. All right, it's still an open case. Let's hear about what's your second favorite out of these 10 cases.
Well, I think my second favorite is one that took place upstate in Lycoming County, which is about 20 miles north of Williamsport. A man and his wife, Henry and Helen Shearer, they were on their way from Attica, New York to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they're driving along Lycoming Creek, and for some reason, they never made it. Hours later, a passing motorist found a car parked alongside the creek. Their 3-year-old daughter was still in the back seat sleeping, and he went around looking for the parents, and he found them in the creek with the husband had a hole in his neck, a stab wound, and the wife had her throat slit completely. And there's just a lot of fishy details in that story, which lead me to believe that it may not have been a murder at all, but actually an accident and followed by a suicide. So some of these murders may not actually be murders so much as they're just peculiar deaths, which were investigated as murder investigations. But in each story, I kind of put in my own 2 cents, piecing together what might have happened. So I do present some interesting, hypotheses, some alternative possibilities of what may have happened. And in that case up in Lycoming County, I believe that, and this is going to sound completely far-fetched, but if you read the book, it will make sense because I lay it out piece by piece. I believe the man was actually stopped to eat lunch. I think he was choking, and I think his wife pulled a penknife out of his pocket, which was found at the scene, tried to perform an amateur tracheotomy, couldn't, and out of grief, I believe she slit her own throat. And that's my theory of how this particular case went down.
But they were eating this food in the car upon their trip?
Yeah, because they left New York at around 7 o'clock that morning, and the body was found in the water of the husband, and his watch was stopped at 9 o'clock a.m. So I believe that after 2 hours of driving, they probably found a nice scenic spot along the creek and decided to have a lunch there. And I think they were probably goofing around, and he may have began choking on his food, because it doesn't seem likely that a person would put a stab wound in one person's neck and then completely slash the throat of another one. There were no traces of blood found in the vehicle. There was no jewelry or money stolen. Robbery definitely wasn't a motive.
And the baby was left behind in the car where they're out there snacking by the creek?
Yeah. The daughter was 3 years old at the time. I mean, obviously she couldn't provide any use. She could barely speak. I mean, she couldn't put any evidence to any answers for the police. But she went to live upstate with the grandmother. And the way the investigation was concluded, it was a murder-suicide. They believed that the husband murdered the wife and then took his own life, but that doesn't seem possible, because if you read the story, there wasn't a drop of blood found on his wife's clothing or anywhere in the vicinity. I mean, how are you going to slash somebody's throat and not get a drop of blood on the clothing? I mean, it just seems very unbelievable. But that was the official conclusion, that he murdered her and then took his own life, and I just don't buy that.
Yeah, if you hit that jugular, it actually spurts out like a water hose, man, and I think it can come flying out of there. Man, the 3-year-old, I guess, is not a suspect, right? I guess he's only 3 years old. But now, what about... I'm sorry, man. But what about... who discovered the scene? And how long was this baby all alone in this car with the parents dead?
Several hours, because it was in a summer in July of 1922. And it was a man, his name was Jeremiah Sales, and he was just driving along Lycoming Creek, which is about 20 miles north of Williamsport, and he saw this car parked alongside the road, and he didn't think anything of it, because Lycoming Creek is actually a very popular trout stream, a lot of fishermen, a lot of outdoorsmen. But as he was driving by, he saw movement in the car and saw that, hey, there's a little kid in the back seat. So being concerned, of course, he stopped his car and began searching for the parents. And he found them down along the edge of the creek, and both of their throats had been cut. One appeared to be a stab wound, the other one slashed from ear to ear.
And what year was this?
1922.
Oh, so definitely no car seats or even seat belts or anything like that.
No.
Yeah. Even when I was a kid, we didn't have seatbelts in our car seats. Okay. But now, what about this fellow who found the baby? Was he considered a suspect at any point?
Oh, no. In fact, I mean, he completely freaked out. I mean, he got in his car, drove to the nearest house, which I believe was a farmhouse, and, screaming his head off and thinking, there's a murderer on the loose. And, the sheriff showed up just a couple minutes later, and he began looking for clues, and, witnesses said they had seen the car parked there since the morning, which seems to fit the timeline that they must have stopped there to eat lunch or a late breakfast. So $80 was found inside the guy's wallet. Also found in the backseat of the car, there was a Kodak camera, and they developed a film, and it showed the couple, and they were a young couple, Henry and Ruth Shearer, and they were smiling, very much in love at the, and it's sad because they must have taken that picture just minutes before they died.
Yeah, I'm a digital forensic investigator, and we had a murder case one time, and I had to process the phone for the defense. And the husband had killed the ex-wife. They had a 9-year-old son, and there were pictures on this phone. And I always try to avoid looking at pictures, the stuff on the phone. I just create the report and just turn it over. And there were all kinds of this family smiling and on camping trips. And this little boy lost his parents, and now the father's in prison. He got a great deal. He got out in 8 years. But just when you see that kind of film evidence or something like that, it's it's just as traumatic as, like you said, seeing those bloody photos in the book. But this is like close up in real life. What drew what made Marlin Bressi find this story, and how did you discover this story? It had to be obscure.
Well, some of these stories I actually knew about for many years. I just never got around to writing them down. Several years ago, I used to live up in Lycoming County. And in fact, Lycoming Creek, where this act took place, I have fished there dozens of times in my life. And like looking at the newspaper photos, I'm pretty sure I know the exact spot where, because there's a unique rock formation down by the creek side. And I'm pretty sure I've actually stood there and fished in that very same spot where this crime took place. And it's one of those things that has passed into like local folklore. You always hear people mentioning about it. People say, don't drive on this road after dark. You'll see the ghost of so-and-so. It's just one of those stories that passed into urban legend that, I finally got around to researching it. And the more I dug up, the more fascinating it became. And that's why I put it in a book, because like, even though they believed that he killed her before killing himself, well, the only sharp object was the penknife, and it was found in his pocket. So if he stabbed himself in the throat, like, how would he put his knife back in his pocket? You don't usually put the knife back in your pocket after you stab yourself in the act of suicide. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but on the other hand, how does she... Okay, it's fine. She tries to do the tracheotomy, okay? Which even back in those days, they didn't even know how to do that. I guess with World War I, I guess they were kind of field handy. But what do you call it? So she tries to do the tracheotomy, and then it fails. And then she suicides by slitting her own throat. Then she folds it up and puts it in his pocket?
Well, I think there's a possibility that she did that. I think that she may have, because this is a very remote area. If you've ever been up in Lycoming County, I mean, your nearest neighbor is like, 10 miles down the road. It's an outdoorsman's paradise. I mean, it's very scenic, very remote. So I think, and by all accounts, Henry Shearer, he was actually a couple of years younger than his wife, and he was known as a goofball. Like, he liked horseplay. He liked to play around. And I think they may have engaged in a little bit of horseplay while they were eating lunch. I think he may have began to choke, and I think, it was too late to get to the hospital. I mean, Nurse Hospital's at least, a 45-minute hour drive away. She may have got the penknife out of his pocket, and when she saw that it failed, I think that she began to panic and put the penknife back in his pocket, and probably sulked around for a couple of minutes thinking, "Oh my God, I'm going to go to jail. I'm going to go to prison. I'm going to lose my kid. My child's going to be taken away." But I think after thinking about it, that, she probably got his shaving razor, and there's no mention of this ever being found, but they were going away on a week-long trip. Now, what man is going to go away on a week-long trip and not take a shaving razor with him? So there had to have been a razor somewhere in their possession. So I think that, she knew it.
Gotcha.
Most people, when they slash their throat, like they put their head back, and that isn't effective because, like, it's hard to reach the jugular vein that way. So I think maybe she was perched over the creek side, put her chin down, slashed her throat with a razor, and that's why no blood got onto her. I think the razor dropped into the creek, and that's why it was never found.
Yeah, and for the audience, we're talking about one of those old-fashioned straight razors, not like you could find, say, like a Bic razor,
Oh, yeah, not like a Gillette. I mean, this is...
Yeah, those old-fashioned straight razors were commonly used as weapons. People would carry them. All right, man. So the Pennsylvania's coldest case is 10 unsolved murders that rocked the Keystone State. We've been talking for about a half hour here. We haven't solved any of them ourselves, Marlin. So give us some other ones. What else can you find in this book here, the Pennsylvania coldest cases?
Well, there's an interesting one that took place in Hershey, right outside of Harrisburg. One day there was a guy, and again, it was another passing motorist who was driving along Union Deposit Road, and down in an embankment, he saw a crashed car that was on fire, and this man jumped down and saw that it was too late to save this guy, and the fire was burning out of control. And they believed that the victim was a 27-year-old guy from Harrisburg named Charles Coldest. And because it was his car and it was his identification that was found inside the car. But then this guy, Charles Coldest, was arrested in Boston 2 years later. But then it became clear that he staged his own death for the insurance money. And Coldest was actually convicted of fraud. He went to prison, served his sentence, but he never said where the body came from. So the question remains, like after a century, how did he get a body? Whose body was it? Was it a murder? This may not have even been a murder. Police believe that he may have stolen it from a graveyard. And a big investigation was made of all the cemeteries in the area, but no bodies were missing. And it's just an odd story because even though he did get convicted and go to prison, it was for a financial crime. It had nothing to do with murder. But to this day, nobody knows where he got the body. I mean, he lived the rest of his life and went to his death without ever divulging this secret. And that's something that's always stuck in my mind because, I'm thinking, how can you just get a body out of nowhere? I mean, it had to have come from somewhere.
Well, if you get like a hitchhiker, then it becomes a body. It starts out a walking, living guy.
I think, he could have struck down somebody who was walking alongside the road and thought, hey, this is a great opportunity to make some money and, stage a death.
Now, what year was that?
That was 1928, I believe.
1928. Now, okay, so he's 27 years old at the time, and he comes up with this scheme. He's going to pull off this insurance job with a dead body. What did he do for employment before that? Do you know?
Well, he bounced around from job to job. He was living in a boarding house. He had an extensive criminal record, but nothing major. He was like a petty thief, a pickpocket. He had a cousin who lived in Reading, and a lot of times they engaged in various capers and, nothing major. I mean, they had rap sheets, but nothing that ever sent them away for too long. And they both bounced from job to job, and it's like they were always scheming to find a way to, a get rich quick scheme. And I think maybe they may have concocted this scheme as a result. And in fact, his cousin, the family was Greek, so his name was Kostas Haldos. And Haldos was also arrested for fraud, but he's the one who suggested that his cousin stole the body from a graveyard. But again, I mean, police checked every cemetery for miles, and they just came up empty-handed. And also, there were no reports of any missing persons during that time. So it's interesting. I mean, it may have been murder, it may not have been murder, but it was such a weird story that I just had to put it in a book.
So 1928, right? Did they even have fingerprints back in those days? Were they doing fingerprints in 28?
Yeah.
They were?
Yep.
Okay, and then what crime did Charles Coldest get picked up for that uncovered his scheme here?
Oh yeah, that was in Boston. I think, again, I don't have the manuscript here in front of me, but I believe he was working at a restaurant as a busboy, and for some reason if memory serves, he was like flashing around a lot of money, and people thought, wait, how did this busboy spend so much money? Because the insurance policy paid out, it was actually the equivalent of $250,000 in today's currency. So like a lot of people who commit financial crimes, they begin flashing around their money and buying extravagant gifts, and it kind of just leads suspicion. And I believe it was a detective who worked for the insurance company who tracked him to Boston and tailed him for days or weeks, and finally concluded that because the man they believed to be Charles Coldest was actually buried in the cemetery. They had a funeral for him and everything. And then it became clear, 2 years after the fact, hey, this guy's still alive and living in Boston. And, he was convicted of fraud, but as far as how he got the body, he refused to say, and nobody ever seemed particularly passionate enough to ask.
How much time did he get for the insurance fraud?
God, to be honest, I don't know off the top of my head.
And I wonder how they could prove it was the same guy. Like, they didn't have DNA back in those days. You know, I guess by pictures, he looked like the same guy. You know,
it is possible. I mean, there are photographs of him in the book. I mean, he did have a distinctive look about him. I mean, he wasn't a guy who would exactly blend into the background.
Okay. All right, that's number 3. We got 7 to go. Pennsylvania's coldest cases, 10 unsolved murders that rocked the Keystone State. We're talking here to Marlin Bressi. And once again, you can meet him in person and try to find out about those horseshoes, man. April 9th in Schuylkill, Pennsylvania, near Pottsville, the Historical Society building at 6:30 p.m. They'll be signing books and all kind of stuff like that. So we got 3 down. Okay, what's another good one?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's move out to the Pittsburgh area. There was what we call the Feely triple murders, in which a whole family, a wife and her 2 children were found dead inside their apartment while the husband was away in New Jersey. And although the police investigation concluded that the wife, in a fit of desperation, killed her children before committing suicide, it's one of those cases where the facts simply don't add up.
So the husband's out of town. How were the bodies discovered?
Well, it was the landlord, a guy named Charles Young, who discovered the bodies. This was June 18th, 1936. He found him on June 18th. The following day, his wife and the 2 children were supposed to take a train to meet their husband in New Jersey. His name was Martin Feely. He was a very young guy, a very good-looking guy. He was a physical education professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And his wife, Eleanor, she was a graduate of Columbia University. She actually held 3 degrees, one in law, one in child psychology, and one in physical education. So this was really an ideal all-American family. I mean, a very young, up-and-coming family with very impressive credentials who lived in an apartment on South Braddock Avenue in Pittsburgh. Well, the landlord found the bodies. I guess he was just walking by and looked in a window and happened to see Eleanor face down in a pool of blood. She was tied to a radiator pipe with a rope fastened around her neck, and into this rope, somebody put a handle of a hammer and twisted it until she was strangled. But when the police arrived, they found the hammer under her body, which seemed like an awkward place to, if you're going to commit suicide.
Yeah, that's a ridiculous suicide attempt, yeah. Unless you're in prison, yeah.
Well, and both the children were strangled, and all 3 had been stabbed through the skull with an ice pick. And interestingly, on Eleanor, the wife, the stab wound was on the left side, and by all accounts, she was right-handed. So it's a very awkward thing to stab yourself with an ice pick on the left side of your head if you're holding it in your right hand. So it's just a lot of these little details that, even though the police concluded that this is obviously what happened, it was a suicide, the facts just don't add up. I mean, they searched for fingerprints on the hammer. They did not find any. Eleanor wasn't wearing gloves, so how did she? It just doesn't add up.
Yeah. Now, how many ice pick wounds to her self-inflicted ice pick wounds were there to her head? More than one?
Just one.
Okay.
The coroner concluded that none of the wounds were enough to be deadly. I mean, they were deep wounds, but not fatal wounds. And I guess after they had been stabbed, somebody strangled all 3 of them. Bobby, who was 5 years old, he was found in his cot in his bedroom with the cord of a bathrobe tied around his neck. Janice, the younger one, was in her crib, faced up. Rope had been wrapped around her neck as well. It seems odd that a woman would have a rope and a hammer to begin with, because Martin Feely, when he learned of the crime, said, "Hey, we don't have any of this stuff around the house." So and also she was tied to the radiator using a sailor's square knot, which seems to be a very odd knot that a woman would choose if it was suicide.
Was Martin a sailor? Was Martin previously a sailboats kind of guy?
I think he probably was, but I mean, after researching his story, I mean, it's obvious that Martin, a lot of people believed he did it, but he never remarried, even though he was a young man at this time. I mean, I think he was like 95 or 96 when he died, and he never remarried, and he was always deeply affected by the murder of his wife and his children, although, he was hauled in for questioning multiple times, and for a long time he was the leading suspect, but I mean, he was in New Jersey at the time. I don't see how, and witnesses saw him in New Jersey, so I don't know how he could have came back, through New Jersey, all the way across Pennsylvania, killed his wife, and then went back to New Jersey. It just doesn't seem to be very plausible.
Especially back in those days, yeah. But now the oldest child was 5 years old?
I believe so. I think one was 5 and one was 3, I think.
Because you got to think, right, the only motive to murder these poor little children was that they would recognize the murderer, and a 5-year-old is old enough to say, yeah, that's Uncle Tom. Oh, that's the landlord. You know what I mean? Well, interestingly, the landlord had a bulldog that was very possessive, very protective, and the landlord's dog did not bark at all during the time when this happened. So, yeah, obviously it was somebody who knew the family well enough to get inside and without making the dog bark. So I think it was somebody who was definitely known to the family, but I don't think it was Martin. And I certainly don't think it was suicide like the police suggested. No, the suicide sounds crazy. Strangle and ice picks. It's just ridiculous. What about was the landlord questions? And how close did he live by? He lived like right there next door?
Yeah, he lived on the floor above.
Okay.
He lived with his wife. He had a teenage son who, that's another theory, and his elderly father-in-law. Of course, all of them were questioned, and all of them were, interrogated very thoroughly, but obviously nothing they said made them suspects. I mean, nobody was ever arrested or charged.
Well, they were property owners. They were landlords. What other kind of occupations did they have in their standing in the community? The landlord and his son.
Well, one thing I did learn is this landlord, Charles Young, while the family was supposed to be away on vacation for a week in New Jersey, he did hire 2 workmen to come in and renovate the apartment. Now, these men were questioned, but they had an alibi. But it seems possible that they would be more likely to have a rope and a hammer than, So I think there's a possibility, but there's questions about that. Like, what would the motive be? Nothing was stolen. Nothing was rearranged. None of the valuables were tampered with. I mean, and usually if a crime like that, you would think robbery would be the motive. There was also no evidence of sexual assault to the body of Eleanor. So if it wasn't a crime of passion, if it wasn't a robbery, why would these 2 workmen want to murder Eleanor and her 2 children? So even though logically you kind of think, well, maybe these 2 workmen, they had a key because they were supposed to come in and do work the following day. But again, what would the motive be for that?
Well, it could have been an attempted sexual battery, and a 5-year-old would be old enough to say, "Hey, yeah, it's those guys that were building on the roof there." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
5-year-old could pull it off. Yeah.
That is true. Now, in the book, you will actually find a map of the crime scene, and all 3 bodies were found in the same room. So I think that is a definite possibility.
Yeah, see, these old cases, these old, like that you enjoy, they're too frustrating for me. Okay? I'm not saying don't buy the book. The book is probably, you hear the way the guy tells a story, man. So the book's he's a great storyteller. Pennsylvania's Coldest Cases, 10 Unsolved Murders That Rocked the Keystone State. Now, it's not even out yet. It's coming out April 15th. I guess you can pre-order, right? No, I don't think you can pre-order. Can you?
Yeah, you can pre-order it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Bookshop.org, and a couple other places.
There you go. So you can pre-order. And, of course, if you want to meet him in person on April 9th, which is before the book is released, maybe you could buy one in person there and get an autographed copy in Schuylkill, Pennsylvania, which is by Pottsville, the Historical Society building at 6:30 p.m. We're talking to Marlin Bressi. I apologize. So we got a couple of minutes left for one. If you want to squeeze in one quick one, like 2 or 3 minutes, what do you got?
Let me think of one I can explain in
one that's solvable, man. Give me one I can solve. Okay.
All right. Well, okay, there's the mystery skeletons of Oyster Patty's Tavern in Pittsburgh. In 1906, workmen were excavating foundation for a new skyscraper, and they uncovered a pair of human skeletons beneath the kitchen of this abandoned building, which had once been a really rough and rowdy bar used as a hangout by thugs and criminals. The coroner refused to investigate it. He actually believed that these were Indians that they found, but that doesn't explain why there was a cheap pocket watch found alongside one of the skeletons. I mean, as far as I know, Indians didn't really have a lot of pocket watches of a modern build. So it's interesting because by the time they found these skeletons, Oyster Patty, that was the nickname of a man named Hugh O'Donnell. That was what everybody called him. Yeah. Well, he was already on his deathbed. He was old and living in West Virginia. Everybody who worked at the tavern was dead. But obviously they were killed inside this tavern, and nobody can figure out who or why. And because the coroner refused to investigate, these bones were just left open on this work site for several days, and curiosity seekers began stealing some of the bones as souvenirs. And that obviously, I mean, the first rule of a crime scene investigation is to cure the crime scene. And obviously things were such a mess that they were never able to figure out who these two unfortunate victims were.
You know, so I actually think I recall hearing that story before. Has that story been written about and publicized?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very well-known story.
Yeah, I think I heard about it.
Yeah.
Okay, we've been talking once again to Marlin Bressi, Bressi. He doesn't have a lot of social media, but you can find him at Pennsylvania's on Amazon, all that kind of stuff. There, you can meet him in person over there, April 9th in Schuylkill at the Historical Society building. And Marlin, I'd like you to look into those horseshoes for me, okay? When you come back.
Hey, I'll get back. Yeah,
no, I'd love to have you come back, though, man. These are great stories. I love this stuff. All right. Maybe for me, I want a little more current, you know? Just squeeze one in there for me for the next interview. Okay, man?
Okay.
No, but Marlin, thank you so much.
All right, thanks for having me.
Good night, sir.
Good night.